My name is Claire Bennett, and I am 32 years old. I have a mortgage on a small house in Portland, Oregon. I have a cat named Muffin who wakes me up at 6:15 every morning by walking across my face. I have a job I don't hate, managing inventory for a medical supply company. I have a therapist I see twice a month, and I have not spoken to my parents in 19 years. Those are the facts of my life, the scaffolding that holds everything up. But the foundation, the cracked, crumbling foundation, is what happened when I was 13 years old. I still remember the exact smell of that truck stop. Diesel and stale coffee and something sweet underneath it all, like rotting fruit in a dumpster out back. My father pulled our blue Ford Taurus into the parking lot at 3:47 in the afternoon. I know it was 3:47 because I was staring at the digital clock on the dashboard, counting down the minutes until we got home. We had been driving for 3 hours from my grandmother's funeral in Spokane, and I had a history test on Monday that I hadn't studied for. I was thinking about the Roman Empire and wondering if I could fake my way through a paragraph about aqueducts. "Get out," my mother said. I thought she was joking. My mother made jokes sometimes, dark, sharp jokes that cut too close to the bone. I laughed, a little nervous laugh, and reached for my backpack on the floor. "I'm serious, Claire. Get out of the car." I looked at my father. He was staring straight ahead, both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, like he was still driving. His jaw was set so tight I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He didn't look at me. Not once. "Mom." "What?" "You're 13 now," she said, and her voice had that flat quality it got when she was done arguing, done explaining, done with everything. "You're old enough to figure things out. Your grandmother just died. Life is hard. You need to learn to be strong." "Dad?" I said, and my voice cracked because I was 13 and my voice did that sometimes, especially when I was scared. "Dad, please." He reached across and opened my door. The mechanism made a grinding sound, like it was in pain too. "You'll figure it out," my mother said. "We believe in you." They believed in me. That was the last thing my mother ever said to me. "We believe in you." As if belief was a blanket you could wrap yourself in on a concrete floor in the middle of nowhere in central Washington. As if belief could stop the cold or the fear or the bone-deep understanding that the two people who were supposed to love you unconditionally had just decided you weren't worth the trouble anymore. I stood there on the crumbling asphalt, my backpack hanging from one shoulder, and I watched the blue Taurus pull back onto the highway. I watched until it was a dot, then nothing. Then I was alone. The truck stop had a diner, a convenience store, and a payphone outside that looked like it hadn't worked since the Reagan administration. I went inside the convenience store because it was November, and the wind was already cutting through my thin jacket. The man behind the counter was maybe 60, with a white beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much of everything. "You lost, kid?" he asked. I shook my head because I couldn't make my voice work. I bought a Snickers bar with the $3 in my pocket and sat in the corner booth of the diner, watching the highway through the window, waiting for them to come back. Waiting for this to be some kind of test, some twisted lesson about independence or resilience or whatever my parents thought they were teaching me. They didn't come back. By 8 p.m., the diner closed. The waitress, her name tag said Darlene, told me I couldn't stay inside. "Insurance," she said, not looking at me. "Sorry, honey." I tried the payphone. It ate my quarter and gave me nothing but dead air. I walked to the edge of the parking lot and looked out into the darkness. There was a field on one side, and on the other, the highway stretched into nothing. I could hear trucks rumbling past, their headlights cutting through the dark like searchlights, but none of them stopped. I found a phone booth behind the truck stop. The glass was cracked, and someone had spray-painted a profanity on the outside, but the roof kept the rain off. That first night, I curled up on the concrete floor with my backpack as a pillow, and my jacket pulled tight around me. I didn't sleep. I listened to the trucks and the wind and the distant sound of a train whistle. And I tried not to cry, because crying meant admitting this was real. And I wasn't ready to admit that yet. In the morning, I was stiff and cold and hungry in a way I'd never been before. The hunger wasn't just in my stomach, It was in my bones, in my teeth, in the spaces behind my eyes. I went back to the convenience store and bought a bag of chips with my last dollar. The old man watched me eat them at the counter. "Your parents coming back?" he asked. "No," I said, and the word felt like a stone dropping into a well. He didn't ask anything else. He gave me a cup of coffee, black, bitter, the first coffee I'd ever drunk, and told me the Greyhound bus came through at noon if I had money. I didn't have money. I had 47 cents and a history test I was definitely going to fail. I spent that day walking along the highway, sticking my thumb out whenever a car passed. Most didn't stop. A few slowed down, the drivers looking at me with expressions I couldn't read: pity, suspicion, fear, and then accelerated away. By late afternoon, I was back at the truck stop, shivering in the phone booth, wondering if I was going to die there. A trucker named Marcus found me. He was black, maybe 40, with a kind face and hands that looked like they'd been through wars. He was hauling frozen chicken to Seattle, and he said he'd give me a ride if I promised not to rob him. "I don't have anything to rob you with," I said. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "That's what all the robbers say." I rode in the cab of his truck for 4 hours. He bought me dinner at a Denny's outside Yakima, pancakes and bacon and orange juice that tasted like heaven, and he didn't ask about my parents. He told me about his daughter, who was 16, and wanted to be a marine biologist. He told me about his ex-wife, who had remarried a dentist. He told me about the time he'd driven through a blizzard in Montana and almost slid off a mountain. When he dropped me at the bus station in Seattle, he pressed $100 into my hand. "Get yourself home," he said, "and don't ever let anyone tell you that you ain't worth keeping." I never saw him again. I don't know if he's still alive, but I think about him sometimes, especially on hard days. Marcus was the first person who showed me that kindness could exist without strings attached, that help didn't have to come with a lecture or a lesson or a price tag. I took a bus to Portland. I had an aunt there, my mother's sister, Aunt Patricia, who I barely knew. She took me in without asking too many questions, and when I finally told her what happened, she didn't call my parents. She didn't try to fix it. She just held me while I cried for 3 hours straight, and then she made me macaroni and cheese and said I could stay as long as I needed. I needed 19 years. I finished high school. I went to community college. I got the job at the medical supply company. I built a life, brick by brick, out of the wreckage of that truck stop. I went to therapy. I learned to trust people, slowly, cautiously, like a deer learning to approach a hand that might hold food or a gun. I had relationships that ended and relationships that never started, and one relationship that lasted 2 years before we both realized we were trying to fix each other instead of loving each other. And through all of it, I never spoke to my parents. Not once. Aunt Patricia died when I was 24. Cancer. Fast and brutal. My parents came to the funeral, but I didn't. I was in Hawaii on a vacation I'd planned 6 months before, and I told myself it was coincidence, that I couldn't have known, that the timing was just bad. That was a lie. I knew. Patricia's neighbor had called me the week before. I booked the flight to Maui the same day. I told myself I was protecting myself. I told myself I was being strong, just like they'd wanted. I told myself a lot of things, but the truth was simpler and uglier. I was afraid. Afraid that if I saw them, I'd collapse into the 13-year-old girl in the phone booth again. Afraid that all the years of building and healing would crumble like wet paper. Afraid that they wouldn't be sorry. That they'd look at me and see the same disappointment they'd seen in that parking lot, and I'd have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. So I ran. I ran to Maui, and I sat on a beach, and I watched the waves, and I told myself I was fine. I was fine. I was always fine. That was 8 years ago. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. I found it in my mailbox when I got home from work, sandwiched between a credit card offer and a coupon for a local pizza place. It was heavy cream cardstock with embossed lettering, the kind of thing that cost too much money and meant too much ceremony. "You are cordially invited to the memorial service for Emily Rose Bennett," it read. Saturday, the 15th of August, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. St. Michael's Episcopal Church, Spokane, Washington. Emily Rose Bennett, my sister. I sat down on my front steps and I read the invitation 3 times. Emily was 3 years younger than me. She would have been 29. We hadn't spoken in 12 years, not since she chose my parents over me, not since she told me I was being dramatic, and that mom and dad had their reasons and I needed to stop playing the victim. I had hated her for that, hated her with a fierceness that scared me, a hatred that burned hot and then cold and then settled into something like indifference. I told myself she was dead to me, just like our parents were dead to me. I told myself I didn't care what happened to her, what she did, who she became. But she was actually dead now. And I was sitting on my front steps in Portland, Oregon, holding an invitation to her funeral, and I couldn't breathe. The memorial service was in 10 days. I had 10 days to decide whether to go, whether to face the family I'd spent 2 decades running from, whether to stand in a church and pretend to grieve for a sister who had chosen sides and chosen wrong. I went inside and poured myself a glass of wine. I sat at my kitchen table and I stared at the invitation until the letters blurred. Muffin jumped into my lap and purred, and I buried my face in her fur and tried not to think about Emily as a child. Emily with her gap-toothed smile and her collection of stuffed rabbits. Emily crying when I left for college because she thought I was abandoning her. I hadn't abandoned her. She'd abandoned me. She'd chosen them. That was the narrative I'd constructed, the wall I'd built around my heart, and it had kept me safe for a long time. But safe isn't the same as whole, and sitting there in my kitchen, I felt the cracks starting to show. I decided to go. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same masochistic impulse that makes people poke at old scars to see if they still hurt. Whatever it was, I booked a flight to Spokane for the Friday before the service, and I spent the next week in a state of low-grade panic, jumping at shadows and rehearsing conversations in my head that I knew would never happen. The flight was uneventful. I rented a car at the airport and drove to a hotel near the church, a generic chain place with beige walls and a view of the parking lot. I checked in and I sat on the bed, and I stared at the ceiling and I tried to remember how to breathe. The service was at 2. I arrived at 1:45, dressed in a black dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion, something modest and forgettable. The church was old, stone and stained glass, the kind of place that smelled like incense and old wood and generations of whispered prayers. I slipped into a back pew and watched the other mourners arrive. I recognized some of them, distant cousins, family friends, people whose faces were familiar but whose names I'd forgotten. And then I saw them. My parents. They were older, of course. My father's hair was completely gray now, what was left of it. My mother had gained weight, and she walked with a slight limp, leaning on a cane. They were sitting in the front row, holding hands, and they looked small and broken in a way that would have satisfied the younger version of me. The younger version of me would have wanted them to suffer. The younger version of me would have stood up and screamed at them, would have made a scene, would have forced everyone in that church to know what they'd done. But I wasn't 13 anymore. I was 32, and I was tired, and I didn't have the energy for rage. The service was beautiful, in a generic way. The priest talked about Emily's kindness, her love of animals, her brief career as a veterinary technician. He talked about her battle with leukemia, the diagnosis that had come too late, the treatments that had failed. He talked about her faith, her courage, her light. I didn't cry. I sat in the back pew with my hands folded in my lap, and I felt nothing but a hollow ache, like a tooth that had been pulled and the gum was still tender. After the service, there was a reception in the church basement. Sandwiches and cookies and weak coffee in styrofoam cups. I stood in a corner, holding a cup I didn't drink from, watching my parents from across the room. They were surrounded by well-wishers, people offering condolences and hugs and casseroles for later. My mother was crying. My father was patting backs and shaking hands, playing the role of the grieving father with a competence that made my stomach turn. I was preparing to leave, to slip out the side door and drive back to my hotel and catch the first flight home in the morning, when someone touched my arm. Claire! I turned. It was my mother. She was standing right in front of me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same perfume she'd always worn, something floral and cloying that made my throat close up. Claire, she said again, and her voice cracked. You came. I came for Emily, I said, and my voice was steady, which surprised me. Not for you. She flinched, and some dark part of me was glad. Can we talk? Please? Your father and we've wanted to reach out for so long. We didn't know how. We didn't think you'd want to hear from us. You were right, I said. I don't. But I didn't walk away. I stood there, frozen, as my father approached, his face a mask of grief and something else. Fear, maybe, or hope, or some toxic combination of both. Claire, he said, you look good. You look grown up. That's what happens when you abandon a child, I said, and my voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the reception like a knife. They grow up. Sometimes they even survive. My mother's face crumpled. My father looked at the floor. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness, not even close, but a kind of release. I had spent 19 years building them into monsters in my mind, and seeing them now, small and old and broken, I realized they were just people. Terrible, flawed people who had made an unforgivable choice, but people, nonetheless. We were wrong, my mother whispered. We know that now. We were grieving your grandmother, and we were scared, and we took it out on you. And we were wrong. There is no excuse. There is nothing we can say that will make it right. But we are sorry. We have been sorry every day for 19 years. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the truth in her eyes. She was sorry. They were both sorry. But sorry doesn't erase 19 years of silence. Sorry doesn't rebuild what was broken. Sorry is just a word, and words are cheap. I appreciate you saying that, I said, and I meant it, which surprised me even more. But I don't know what you want from me. You want forgiveness? You want me to say it's okay? It's not okay. It will never be okay. We don't expect forgiveness, my father said. We wanted you to know. We wanted to see you. One last time. One last time. The phrase hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I didn't understand. And then my mother reached into her purse and pulled out a red envelope. This was in Emily's things, she said, holding it out to me. She left instructions that it should be given to you. At her memorial, she said you'd understand. I took the envelope. It was heavy, weighted with something more than paper. My name was written on the front in Emily's handwriting, loopy, familiar, the same handwriting that had filled the margins of her notebooks with doodles of rabbits and hearts. She wanted to reach out too, my mother said, so many times, but she was afraid. She thought you'd hate her. She thought she'd chosen wrong, and she didn't know how to fix it. I looked at the envelope, at my name in my dead sister's hand, and I felt the wall around my heart crack open. Not crumble, just crack, a fissure of light in the darkness. Thank you, I said, and I turned and walked out of the church basement, out into the August heat, the envelope clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I didn't open it in the hotel. I didn't open it on the flight home. I carried it in my purse for 3 days, feeling its weight, imagining what was inside. A letter, probably. An apology. A confession. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe just a blank piece of paper. Emily's final joke on a world that had never been kind to her. On the 3rd night, I sat on my couch with Muffin in my lap and a glass of wine on the table, and I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, 3 pages of Emily's loopy handwriting and a photograph. The photograph was of me and Emily, maybe 10 and 7, sitting on a porch swing at our grandmother's house in Spokane. We were eating watermelon, juice running down our chins, laughing at something off camera. I didn't remember the moment, but looking at it, I felt a pang so sharp it took my breath away. We had been happy once. We had been sisters. I set the photograph aside and unfolded the letter. Dear Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about a lot of things. I know you think I chose them over you. I know you think I betrayed you. And maybe I did. But the truth is more complicated than that, and I don't have time to make it simple. So I'm just going to tell you what happened, and you can hate me or forgive me or burn this letter. It's up to you. After they left you at that truck stop, Mom and Dad came home and pretended nothing had happened. They told me you were staying with Aunt Patricia for a while, that you needed space, that everything was fine. I was 10. I believed them. It wasn't until I was 14 that I found out the truth. I overheard them fighting, Mom crying, Dad shouting that it was her idea, that he'd gone along with it because he was too weak to stop her. I confronted them. I screamed at them. I told them I was going to find you and bring you home. They begged me not to. They said they'd go to jail. They said I'd be taken away, put in foster care, that my life would be destroyed. They said they'd change, that they'd make it right, that they'd find a way to bring you back. And I believed them. I was 14. And I was scared. And I believed them. I spent the next 10 years waiting for them to keep that promise. They never did. They talked about it sometimes, made plans that never materialized, sent checks to Aunt Patricia that she always returned. And I watched you build a life without us, watched you graduate and work and become this strong, independent person who didn't need anyone. And I was proud of you, Claire. I was so proud. But I was also jealous, because you got out, and I was still trapped in that house with their guilt and their silence and their endless, suffocating regret. When I got sick, I decided to reach out. I wrote you a dozen letters that I never sent. I called your work and hung up when someone answered. I drove to Portland once and sat outside your apartment building for 3 hours, too scared to go inside. I'm a coward, Claire. I've always been a coward. I chose the easy path every time, and I told myself it was for the best, that I was protecting everyone, that the truth would only hurt more people. But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of Mom and Dad. Scared of you. Scared of facing what I'd done. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I loved you. I never stopped loving you. And if there's anything after this, I'll be waiting for you, with watermelon juice on my chin and a stupid joke on my lips, and we can be sisters again. I also want you to know something else. Something I only found out 6 months ago, when I was going through Mom's things, looking for money to pay a bill. There's a safe deposit box at First National Bank in Spokane, box 847. The key is taped to the back of this letter. Inside the box is everything: documents, records, the truth about what really happened that day, and why. Mom and Dad didn't just abandon you because they were grieving and scared. There was another reason. A reason they've been hiding for 19 years. And Claire, it's bad. It's worse than you think. I'm sorry I can't be the one to tell you. I'm sorry I'm leaving you with this. But I think you deserve to know. I think you've deserved to know for a very long time. I love you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Emily. I read the letter 3 times. Then I turned it over and found the key, a small brass thing taped to the back with clear tape that had yellowed with age. I sat on my couch for a long time, the letter in one hand and the key in the other, feeling the world tilt beneath me. Another reason. A reason worse than grief and fear. 19 years of silence, 19 years of pain, and there was a secret at the bottom of it all. A secret my sister had discovered and my parents had hidden. I thought about calling them. I thought about flying back to Spokane and confronting them, demanding answers, making them tell me to my face. But I was tired of their words, their excuses, their endless cycle of regret and denial. If there was a truth, I wanted to find it myself. I booked a flight for the next morning. The bank was on Main Street in downtown Spokane, a brick building with tall windows and a marble floor that echoed under my shoes. I walked up to the desk and asked for access to safe deposit box 847. The clerk, a young woman with pink hair and a nose ring, checked my ID and the key and led me to a private room in the back. "Take your time," she said, closing the door behind her. The box was larger than I expected, maybe 18 inches long and a foot wide. I inserted the key and turned it, and the lid lifted with a soft click. Inside was a stack of papers, a manila envelope, and another photograph. I started with the photograph. It was black and white, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed a woman standing outside a house, holding a baby. The woman was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and a familiar shape to her face. The house was familiar too, a small bungalow with a porch swing and a rose bush by the door. My grandmother's house. I turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back, in my grandmother's hand, Patricia and Claire, June 1992. Patricia and Claire, my aunt and me. But I was born in 1993, and my mother, my supposed mother, was named Margaret. Patricia was her sister. I set the photograph down and reached for the papers. They were legal documents, birth certificates, and adoption records and court filings. I read them slowly, carefully, each word sinking into my brain like a stone into water. My mother, Margaret, had been unable to have children. A medical condition, something with her ovaries. She and my father had tried for years, had gone through fertility treatments and miscarriages and finally given up. And then, in 1992, Patricia had gotten pregnant. Patricia was 19, unmarried, living with their mother in Spokane. She hadn't planned to keep the baby, had been looking into adoption options. And Margaret, desperate for a child, had made her an offer. Adopt the baby. But don't tell anyone. Don't file paperwork. Don't go through agencies. Don't leave a trail. Raise the child as your own for the first year, and then we'll take her. We'll say she's ours. We'll move away, start fresh, and no one will ever know. Patricia had agreed. She'd had the baby, me, and cared for me for 13 months. And then Margaret and my father had taken me and moved to Portland, and Patricia had stayed in Spokane, heartbroken but silent, bound by a secret she'd promised to keep. But secrets have a way of surfacing. And when I was 12, my grandmother had found out. She'd discovered the truth somehow. Maybe Patricia had confessed. Maybe she'd found the documents herself, and she'd threatened to tell me. She'd said I deserved to know who I really was, that the lie had gone on long enough. Margaret had panicked. She'd convinced my father that the only way to keep the secret was to get rid of me, to abandon me, to make me disappear, to ensure that I never came back asking questions. They'd driven me to that truck stop and left me there, not because they were grieving or teaching me a lesson, but because they were terrified that my grandmother would tell me the truth. And then, my grandmother had died, and the threat had died with her. And they'd spent 19 years living with what they'd done, justifying it to themselves, telling themselves it was for the best, that I was better off not knowing. I wasn't their daughter. I was Patricia's. My aunt, who had taken me in without question, who had held me while I cried, who had never once hinted at the truth. She'd known. She'd always known. And she'd loved me anyway, loved me enough to keep the secret that had destroyed her sister's soul. I sat in that private room for an hour, maybe 2, reading the documents over and over, trying to make sense of a life that had suddenly shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't Claire Bennett, daughter of Margaret and Robert. I was Claire. What? Claire who? Did Patricia even give me a last name before they took me away? The manila envelope contained more. Letters from Patricia to my grandmother, written in the months after I was taken. She'd begged for me back, threatened to go to the police, threatened to tell the truth. My grandmother had talked her down, convinced her that exposing the lie would destroy everyone, that I was better off with a stable family, that Patricia was too young to be a mother. And then, years later, A letter from my grandmother to Patricia, written shortly before she died. I'm going to tell Claire the truth, it said. She deserves to know. And if Margaret tries to stop me, I'll tell everyone. I'll ruin her. Margaret had stopped her, in the most permanent way possible. I didn't know if my grandmother's death was natural or not. The documents didn't say. But I knew with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold that my parents, my kidnappers, were capable of anything to protect their secret. I put everything back in the box and closed the lid. I walked out of the bank and into the Spokane afternoon, and I stood on the sidewalk and I breathed. Just breathed. In and out, while the world spun around me. I thought about going to the police. I had proof, birth certificates, adoption records, letters. I could have them arrested. I could tell the world what they'd done. I could destroy them, the way they'd tried to destroy me. But I was tired. Tired of anger, tired of revenge, tired of carrying the weight of their sins on my shoulders. I was 32 years old, and I had a life in Portland, and a cat, and a therapist, and I didn't want to spend the next 32 years in courtrooms and headlines, reliving the worst moments of my life for a public that would forget my name in a week. So I made a different choice. I flew back to Portland. I went to my therapist and I told her everything: the truck stop, the letter, the safe deposit box, the truth about my birth. She listened, and she cried. And she helped me understand that the family I'd built for myself was real, that blood didn't define love, that I was allowed to grieve the family I'd lost while celebrating the one I'd found. And then I wrote a letter of my own. Dear Margaret and Robert, I know the truth. I know what you did, and why you did it, and I know that your regret is real. But regret doesn't erase the past, and forgiveness doesn't mean I have to let you back into my life. I am not your daughter. I never was. But I am also not defined by where I came from or who gave birth to me. I am defined by the choices I make and the people I choose to love. I choose to love Aunt Patricia, who raised me when you abandoned me, who kept your secret out of love for me, who gave me a home when you took mine away. I choose to love Emily, who tried so hard to make things right and failed, because she was human and flawed and scared, just like all of us. I choose not to hate you. Hate is a burden I no longer have the strength to carry. But I also choose not to have you in my life. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. I hope you find peace. I hope you learn to live with what you've done. And I hope, someday, you understand that the child you threw away grew up to be someone strong enough to walk away from you forever. Claire. I didn't send it. I folded it and put it in a drawer, next to Emily's letter and the photograph of us on the porch swing. Someday, maybe, I'd send it. Or maybe I'd burn it. It didn't matter. The act of writing it was enough. That was 6 months ago. I still live in Portland. I still have my job and my cat and my therapist. I visit Patricia's grave sometimes, and I talk to her, and I tell her about my life, and I thank her for loving me enough to let me go. I don't know what happened to Margaret and Robert. I don't care. They are ghosts now, fading memories of a life that was never really mine. But I know who I am. I know where I came from. And I know that I am strong, not because they taught me to be, but because I survived them. And that, finally, is enough.